having that positive faith in the future is just so important in terms of creating positive outcomes. And right now, there's so much despair, there's so much cynicism, there's so much kind of lack of faith. It's a very, very troubling time. And this is a time where we need to think future back and say, what do we all have in common? And what do we believe in? And then take that kind of leap of faith together.
I'm Lisa K. Solomon, and this is How We Future, where I talk to some of my favorite changemakers about shaping tomorrow, starting today. What helps us stay grounded and move forward when we can't know what's coming next? Season 4 of How We Future is about big ideas, and today's big idea is hope. I'm joined by Bob Johansen and Bishop Andy Doyle, co-authors of Disciplines of Hope, Generating Faith in the Future for an Anxious Age. Together, they explore why hope is more than wishful thinking or blind optimism. In fact, it's a deliberate practice that helps us lead through complexity, strengthen our communities, and imagine futures worth working towards. In this episode, we unpack why clarity matters more than certainty, what faith can teach us about navigating change, and how each of us can become better ancestors for generations that follow. Let's get started with Bob and Andy. I am just thrilled that you are here. Thank you so much for joining us. As I shared earlier, this is the first time I'm interviewing a bishop. So Bishop Andy, thank you so much for joining us. And Bob, you and I have known each other a long time. And I'm thrilled to be talking about your forthcoming book called Disciplines of Hope, Generating Faith in the Future. So what a thrill to be talking. And we should say that you have a third author that's not with us today, Jeremy Kirschbaum, who calls himself an AI engineer and poet. So I know you're early on in talking about this book, but I have to say from the beginning, it sets up a little bit like a joke, as you might know. A futurist, a bishop, and an AI engineer walk into a bar. So maybe we'll start there. Bob, what motivated you to write this book? This is your 15th book, I think, on exploring the realm of futures. What motivated you to really lean into the topic of faith?
I've been struggling with it for a long time. I've actually wanted to write the book for 20 years or so and have been searching for the right frame, for the right partner, for the right time. And this mix of Andy, Jeremy, and these very strange times we're in now, these very chaotic, very despair-oriented times. It just seemed like this was the right time. And getting together with Andy and Jeremy, we were able to create something, finally. But this has been a very long time in coming.
Well, in many ways, Bob, I think it's a little full circle for you. My understanding is that your study of religion and world religion is what got you into this many decades career of futures and professional futurism.
Yeah, it's really true. I went to divinity school before I did my doctorate, and I went to the divinity school Martin Luther King went to, and I was there when Dr. King was killed. And I was then selected to be in a program that was taught by some of his original professors to try to recreate the intellectual influences he was under at the time he was in seminary before he did his doctorate. And that is what caused me to become a futurist. I never got ordained, but I did get called to the future.
For sure. Well, I have nicknamed you the Minister of Futures Framing because, as we're going to talk about, you are one of the best framers of the futures to make us sense. But Bishop Andy, you, I imagine, practice disciplines of hope and generating faith every day in the work that you do.
Yes. Well, and I have to say that I met Bob first in 2008, and it was inspirational to begin to think differently about how we as an organization could even do the work that seems so normal for us. Yet as an organization of people, we're so similar to everybody else, which is at times like this, we need to be reminded of hope, that there is a future ahead of us, that there are partnerships to be made. And sometimes those partnerships are unlikely, and sometimes the future is provocative. And yet at the same time, this kind of deep tradition of being called forward, being invited into something. These are certainly patterns that I think are recognized not just in the text, but in Bob's and my own relationship, and now with Jeremy, that really pushed forward or created out of our conversations this book.
This book is truly beautiful, but you say very early on, Andy, building on that, this is not a religious book, but draws on religion seriously. And it's not a technology book, but takes generative AI seriously as a medium to reshape meaning. And I mean, already you're setting up a very interesting tension and aspiration, really, about like, we're going to go deep into faith and we're not going to shy away from this real thing that's happening called generative AI. Andy, maybe I'll start with you about, finding that mix of maybe grounding in religious practice, but making it accessible to all.
Sure. I think that a piece of where I find the two enrich, that kind of Venn diagram where there's a shared experience of people across that spectrum really doesn't require any particular type of religion. But what we found in our conversations is we kept coming back to this idea that the world is filled with opportunity of hope, creativity, that these were markers on both sides amongst this triduum, this three-part conversation, if you will, where we weren't limited, but actually found a conversation that was expansive, hopeful, imaginative, creative, and that there's a piece of both sitting and being present, of being aware that we're not by ourselves in this creation, in this world, that I really think is shared across a religious and humanist spectrum that hopes the very best for all of us and sees flourishing not as an individual practice, but as a communal practice, and one where each of us benefits in that way. And I think that drives deeply, not just a sense of, oh, you have to have a particular faith, but that amongst us, there is a conversation to be had about how we can be better people for the living of life. And not just for the living of my life, but for the living of the community's life.
Yeah. And generations to come. I mean, there's a
Oh,
deep sense of
yes.
being
Yeah.
a good steward of what's to come, even not in this life. And I will say, Andy, I appreciate it throughout the book very much. It weaves in many faiths, not just your faith or Jeremy's faith or Bob, your faith. It's a very inclusive book for the faith of humanity. I really saw that. And Bob, as we talked about earlier, both this idea of pulling on religious practices and what's happening in AI, as you say, kind of elicit a wide range of responses. As you say, this book was written between disgust and awe. And I wonder if you could, those are pretty extreme. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's something that emerged as we were writing, and beginning with our publisher, Barrett Kohler, an amazing publisher that I've worked with my last 6 or 7 books. Beginning with them, it made us realize how many people have been wounded by faith and for whom the word faith is a trigger. It's a negative trigger. We knew going in that AI was a trigger. So there we were, kind of caught between this kind of disgust reaction, which is largely emotional, and it's heartfelt in many cases where people really had bad experiences with religion in particular. So we really struggled with how do we reframe this conversation so we accept the gifts of the traditions of faith, but we reject the harm, because we don't want to write off faith. Faith is so important. And if you think of it as a kind of a meaningful leap, that's why it's called a leap of faith in the Bible, but it's a meaningful leap that has meaning, but in a highly uncertain, increasingly BANI future, as we call it, drawing from Jaime Casio's term, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And that whole BANI future, it aches. It aches for faith, and yet it's got to be a faith that touches people without turning them off.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful, and I appreciate that you really name that disgust is a boundary condition. It holds us back, even though it may be a reaction looking for safety. It doesn't serve us well.
Right.
And awe is a pull emotion. It's an expansive one. If we allow ourselves to be curious and maybe even creative in the quest, that can be one that's communal. And I appreciate it. Here's, just one of the many quotes. You say, to make better futures, we need new disciplines for hope in action that you perform repeatedly together, not hope or faith that you simply have or don't have. And Andy, I want to turn it back to you because one of the big things that strikes me in this book is that faith is not a noun. We think of it like, I have it, I don't have it. You're asking people to reconsider faith as a verb, as a
Exactly.
doing.
Right. Well, and think about where that harm often comes from. It comes from having it, not having it, telling you have it, telling you don't have it, right? That these are the kind of ways. And I would argue too that here is the great divisive debate between science, philosophy, and theology as well. Either you are part of this group or not part of this group. What I'm suggesting, I think all three of us were really enlivened by the conversation that said, wait a minute, if we set aside this kind of noun for a moment and begin to say, well, what does it mean to practice? What does it mean to do this work together? Well, all of a sudden, there's energy in the room about the possibilities of what we can do. And each one of us brings necessary boundaried lives, but boundaried traditions, whether it's the scientific, technology, or faithful community. Each of us has places that are going to be edges for us. But our hope is that in practicing it together, those edges become transformative for us. And in the leaning together, what we do is we actually begin to create community. Just as I'd never worked with Jeremy before, but I would suggest that Jeremy and Bob and I are now this kind of mini practicing community of the very thing that we offer in the book.
It's one of the gifts of the book, the fact that you're modeling working together across a variety of differences towards a common goal, which is clearly like belief in humanity and belief in others. And there's one thing to like teach about it. And we obviously hear a lot about the polarities of what's happening today, the political divisiveness. It's another thing to do. I mean, I think this book is a
Right.
model of the exact practice that you're trying to further. And Bob, you had mentioned BANI framework. You and I for years were on the VUCA worlds, right? Filled with
VUCA.
volatility,
Right.
uncertainty,
Yes.
complexity, and ambiguity. And I know with Jamais, you have been moving to BANI. And it's one of those frameworks, as I said, a gift of yours. You're a sense maker, you're a pattern recognizer, and then you're a communicator, into having a more accurate language to just name what's going on. And ever I think you call yourself a humble optimist. You have another side to each one of those. So I wonder if we could just pause for a minute and talk about the BANI framework. And, maybe what working with Andy and Jeremy helped you think differently about around how to turn those into positive.
Sure. Framing the future is so important. And one of the big lessons we've learned over the years at Institute for the Future, we're now the longest running futures think tank around. And one of the things we've learned is if you frame the future accurately, it draws you toward the future. But if you get it wrong, if you frame the future incorrectly, or if you just don't think about it, you're just not as future ready. You're not able to pursue the preferred future that you actually want. And Jamais convinced me, and then we ended up writing a book together with Angela Williams, the CEO of United Way, called Navigating the Age of Chaos. And that deep understanding of this new frame that Jamais has brought to us, this new frame is so important, but it really, again, calls out for this need for more positive images of the future and having a kind of confidence, or in the book, we actually use the word faith interchangeably with the word hope. And I know there's trade-offs there, but we're trying to draw from the gifts and, again, avoid the harm. So we interchange hope and faith. But what we're realizing is that having that kind of positive faith in the future is just so important in terms of creating positive outcomes. And right now, there's so much despair, there's so much cynicism, there's so much kind of lack of faith, there's so much kind of questioning, kind of what's true, what can you believe? It's a very, very troubling time. And what we all feel is that this is a time where we need to think future back and say, what do we all have in common? And what do we believe in? And then take that kind of leap of faith together. And we're hoping this book gives people the frameworks and the disciplines and the suggestions. We're not telling you what to believe. We're not telling you what to have faith in. We're giving you the tools and the framework and the media to help you create your own discipline of faith.
It's so powerful. It can't be said enough. The power of envisioning a future you want to be a part of.
Mm-hmm.
And without that, as our dear friend Ahmed Best, another brilliant
Yes.
futurist, says, don't
Yeah.
let people future all over you.
Yeah.
Who are you outsourcing your
Yeah.
future to if you
Yeah.
don't
Right.
pause to think about, as you said, the frame in which, right? We can't predict the future, as we know, and your many books remind us, but we can have a belief about it. We
Mhm.
can be intentional about the direction that we want to bring forward. And I will say that is exactly why I started How We Future. Exactly that we didn't
Mm.
have enough
Yeah.
models of people that were being agentic in a world that feels out of
Yes.
control in the most accessible ways. I mean, I hope
Yeah.
agentic is the most jargony word I use. I have athletes and I have coaches and now have religious leaders. And it's all about reminding us that we have so much more
Mm.
control around the questions we ask, the micro actions that we take, the beliefs that we have. And I think your book gives people grounding from which to say, oh, I don't need to make this up by myself. This is not only a productive way, this is a durable way.
Mhm.
This is a resilient way. And
Mm.
Bob, if I could have a nickel for every time I quote you, when you say the future will reward clarity, but will punish certainty,
Mm-hmm.
I would have a lot of money to build community. And this really speaks to that first principle that you talk about around this brittle world that we're in. You advocate for us to make it more bendable, but not
Mhm.
bendable, as you say, Gumby style, bendable within clarity of direction. And I
Mhm.
wonder if you could talk a little bit about that first one that is so foundational.
Yes, for sure. It's something I've been saying and realizing for a long time now, and it probably is the most memorable thing I've ever written. That I get feedback about that almost every day. And I think in this kind of world, in this BANI future, you need to be very clear about direction, and you can be clear about direction even with all this chaos. So you want to find that clarity, and that's where thinking future back can help you find it. You look back in time for patterns. And then you have to figure out, well, what's the clarity of direction? What's the resilient clarity story? And it must be told as a story. I mean, futurists have to be great storytellers. Leaders have to be great storytellers. And that resilient clarity is the kind of framing of your bendability. So, we all have to be flexible, but you want to be clear, you can't be certain. And, I learned the VUCA term when from my teaching at the Army War College, and I'm not a military guy, but I still teach there. I get the new 3-star generals on their first week in Washington, and I get them 5 at a time. They're reading the Navigating the Future book now. They'll be reading the new Disciplines of Hope book when it comes out this fall. And I've learned so much from them because they have their whole language around this. They call it commander's intent or mission command. And, the best militaries in the world now are no longer command and control. Command and control just doesn't work. So even though there's a temptation for certainty and, so many people want certainty, it isn't sustainable in this kind of world. And we have to learn that. So we can have clarity, but certainty is dangerous.
Yeah. I think it's what, as you said, leads to that brittleness. And I
Yes.
think the other piece that it was so powerful as a visual for me as I read it is that you say when it's brittle, it doesn't just break, it like really
Shatters,
disintegrates,
yeah.
it shatters, right? That
Yes.
image of the bridge, or even as democracy, you say like these structures that we think
Mm.
are solid, right, are really so
Mm.
much more vulnerable, in part because maybe we're over indexing on that certainty versus
Uh-huh.
the clarity, what it all stands for.
Mhm.
Andy, there's another incredible line in here where you say the BANI future will bleed faith and hope. Yet humans need some kind of faith or hope, whatever you call it, in the future to operate confidently in the present. And I imagine and would love to hear from you how that shows up in your community. Like, what are some of the things that you do to foster that sense of collective faith and practicing together to really be more resilient and more hopeful amid all of this change?
Well, I think part of it is to claim a hold of being addressed or beckoned by that which is ahead of us, the sense that we're being pulled, and then to focus, I think, on the goodness of that shared positive future. I was thinking a little bit while you all were talking that when you write a book, and if it's a narrative or you're telling a story, or if you're working on a piece of art, whether it's a sculpture or 2D, film, whatever it is, that there is this language that the artist, whether author, painter, begins to partake in, whereby the item that you set out to create is not something of certainty, but begins a conversation with you and pulls you into the actual work itself. And I think Jeremy, to represent a little bit, would say that that's part of the capacity that we have together and that we're learning in terms of best practices with AI, in fact, is that it's not to seek certainty from AI, but rather to do what ancient traditions and my tradition has been practicing for a really long time, which is leaning into the future with others, having conversation together, whereby people are pulling the very best of each other forward. Now, does that mean that Christianity and other religions haven't also pulled the worst of each other? Well, of course it does, because we're human beings, and that happens everywhere. It's not just something that a religious community is, but when we see communities doing their very best, they imagine and can hope for a different future. So I'll give you just one quick example. We had a health system, and the health system really needed some specialized leadership that we didn't feel like we could provide. This was at the moment where we were going to electronic records. I mean, just massive changes we were headed into. The Bush presidency had been very clear as the presidency before that healthcare change was going to manifest over the next several decades in ways that we as a church, because we own the organization, weren't going to be able to deliver. And so actually looking at the crisis and trying to figure out, well, how can we imagine a hopeful future for the city of Houston where the hospital doesn't go away, where the nurses and doctors can still work, where they have the cash influx that they need, where the Diocese of Texas as a religious community might actually figure out how to deliver health, not health care, to the community in which it finds itself, chose to transition that health system, whereby the city of Houston got billions of dollars of influx from its new owner and continued its work growing the capacity of that health system today to where it is. And we're able to press health, not healthcare, into rural and urban communities that we never could have imagined before. And we did that by leaning together, listening, hoping, having conversation, believing that the best was out there for the health system, for the city of Houston, and for the people we serve. Just a good example, practical one that I think answers your question of where have I seen it in my community.
I think that's such a phenomenal example of exactly what, Bob, you and Jamay explore in the BANI framework. That's to me, that was a great one around the
Right.
anxiety part, right? There's a big change coming. It's going to affect a lot of people. It is heightening anxiety about what might be. You talk about anxiety as a future fear. And then, Andy, you and your colleagues and partners within the community leaning into that awareness piece to say what might happen and how do we get ahead of it, Bob, maybe a future back. And
Mm-hmm.
again, that borrowing of of future back framing to say this is about health, not just healthcare, right? This is something
Right.
broader. How do we make it inclusive? So I just think that is such a beautiful example of anticipating what might happen, imagining your preferred future, then perhaps being more expansive in the kinds of partnerships and relationships. And we shouldn't probably overlook the fact that it's built, Andy, I'm sure, on the trust that you have built
Yes.
in your community by probably how you've shown up week after week, moment after moment, so that you had a community that was willing to lean into this possibility with you.
Right. And by invitation, right? So again, not certain, not control, invitation to participate, continuing to listen, to reflect, to move forward together, to choose to stay at the table, even when we might not agree. That those are pieces. And I think for the leader who wants to practice a discipline of hope, you actually have to own this yourself, right? So in the organization, but as I think the Institute for the Future and Bob will tell you, what we've learned over the years, what I've learned from their own teaching, is that it only works with the people in the organization doing it. That you can't just do a consultant comes in, tells you what to do, and so we're going to control this. It really has to do with this communal way of working together.
Yeah. And what I also hear in that is that it's a living practice. And, Bob,
Mm-hmm.
you and I have been in the futures world for a long time. I think since COVID, futures and futures disciplines having a meteoric rise. One of my worries is exactly, Andy, what you're saying is that we're getting into that mode of like, let's just do a futures boot camp and now I'm future ready. And that's not what it's about. It's really about expanding the conversation, expanding our worldview, our mindsets in an ongoing way. It's not sort of one and done where check, I'm ready now. And it's a great segue to a huge part that I love in the book, which is the credible hope compass that you created. And as I was reading, and I'm just showing here for those on video, my very chicken scratch interpretation of the compass that I then, honoring the invitation of the book, turned to my friend Gemini to say, hey, can you make it a little bit more legible?
Yeah.
So now I'm holding up a slightly more legible, but still handwritten, credible hope compass, which you call, and I love this, sanctuary for social imagination. Again, an invitation. It's not a map, but Bob, maybe we can continue chatting a little bit about,
Sure.
the compass. Like, how did you come up with the compass and maybe talk through some of the elements of it?
Sure. And this phrase, the kind of sanctuary for imagination, that's an Alvin Toffler. So it's kind of a hat tip to his wonderful book, Future Shock, that goes all the way back to 1966 and 1970 was when the book came out. But that whole idea of the social imagination, we need that, but we need a compass to get us through that. So it's again a navigation metaphor. And what are the ways of thinking about that navigation? It always begins with outcome. What's your outcome that you're seeking? That's the clarity. So that's the clarity. Then it involves community and how do you sort that through? And of course there's ethics that's involved and there's evidence. And to me it links to one of the most amazing traditions in the Episcopal faith and Andy's faith that I've found as I've learned about it is this notion of discerning questions and discernment. We're very interested in it at Institute for the Future in this idea of discerning. I like that concept better than discernment because it's never really over.
Mm-hmm.
It's discerning. But Andy, maybe you could jump in here and start from this notion of discerning questions and how the compass is a way of not necessarily answering, but figuring out how do you navigate your way forward in the face of all this uncertainty.
Well, and I think that's where the provocation also kind of lands squarely in the midst of the cycle, right? So that the cycle and the compass, they all reflect one another in different ways of looking, but a different kind of icons, if you will, of something that isn't set, right? So if you're going to imagine a future, you know that we're heading in a direction, but what we're truly trying to do is aim in the same direction together. And that with boundaries that the compass offers, it allows us to kind of have the edges, but to imagine together, to discern together, to invite questions. Well, I've sat with leaders so many times and to say, okay, that's one scenario, but let's back up for a second. What are some other questions we might have? For instance, this is a great piece right now. We've had the Pope just recently speak out about AI. The response has been pretty strong against AI, but AI is not going anywhere, right? I mean, it's already integrated into most everything that we do, whether we know that or don't know that. And so the question isn't really about I mean, that's a fear-based question about the future rather than to back up and say, well, and I think this is where Jeremy really helps us too. It's like, what are the discerning questions about how this gets used? How can it make us, the Archbishop of Canterbury just addressed the House of Lords leading into the question about AI. She asked very clearly, how does this make us better humans, right? These are really fascinating questions. How does it make us better community members? So certainly we can battle the same things we've always battled, which is greed and abuse and harm that humans tend to do to each other. But that's not the only question. So can we discern some positive questions? And are there boundaries that we as a people may hold together? And that's where the ethics come in, right? Like this sense that we're going to hold each other accountable, seeking not to harm, but do our very best for each other. And what are those discerning questions that come up? And can we sit with them and not, again, right? We're going to leap towards certainty, but could we instead hold a little longer, as Daniel Kahneman says, right? Get to the second, third, fourth thought and seek better clarity, right? That's the opportunity the compass holds for us. And then to come back, right? So we tried that and not to see, oh, we missed the certain future. No, we tried something. We created something and we have to learn. Harvard Business School, I think, has been at us forever to try and learn from our mistakes, right? So this opportunity to see that as a moment to redo the forecast thinking.
I will say, as Andy was talking, Bob, I was really thinking about the nonlinear to neuroflexible axes that you talk about. And I think Andy is really describing a world that will not unfold in a linear way, right? Even if the Pope comes out against AI, it's not like AI goes away, right? We're still going to have, it's going to be a huge part. We don't exactly know. But this idea that we can experiment our way forward using the compass. And I will say, I love the compass metaphor. You may recall that in the book that I wrote about designing strategic conversations, we used a compass as well, realizing that many people were taught to have conversations about the future with an intended outcome or answer on the other side that felt more like going for a bullseye, right? A single right answer versus an exploratory tool. Like, did we, get closer to the outcomes? Did we really honor the community? Did we honor our ethics? How do we know, right? What is the evidence?
Right.
And so my humble hope is that a lot of educators will pick up this book, whether they're teaching in a religious school or not, hopefully not, to give our students a sense of resilience and tools that they can use to check in with themselves and also check in with their peers and where their community is. I think it's a conversation tool as well.
Yeah, definitely. Jeremy brought to the book this idea of using generative AI in a way that actually creates positive friction and allows us to repeat again and again, because repetition is so important to learning. We tend to discount that, and particularly our coping methods psychologically with the BANI future, they require things like mindfulness and meditation and various spiritual practices just to keep ourselves together. Those require repetition. They require friction, where so much of the early application of AI is, oh, let's make it faster, let's make it more efficient. And that's fine, but that's not the big story. The big story is, Tom Malone at MIT says, it's humans and computers doing things together that have never been done before. That's the big story. And that actually requires useful friction to make it work, to have a way of learning.
Yeah. We invited Bob Sutton on How We
Oh, nice.
Future, and his latest work is called The Friction Project. And we
Oh,
went
Bob's
deep into
Hmm.
wonderful.
this
Yeah.
exact question
Yeah.
about how do we remove unnecessary friction,
Yes.
but also ensure that we have productive friction so
Yes.
that we make the bad things harder, right?
Yes.
And the good things easier.
Yes. Bob's
And
work is so important here. Yeah.
oh, it's so important. I think he was one of the first to name, like, not all friction is
Yes.
bad. And of course, this won't surprise you being a design nerd that I am. I think of that as design,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Right. What are the
Right.
affordances that you're putting into place? And again, Andy, I think like the beauty of having, I think it's over 72,000 members of your broader community in Texas, right? The touch points, the number of touch points that you can have to have people experience what does a beautiful experience look like, right? That didn't have the unnecessary friction, whether it's praying together, being alongside of each other on a regular cadence. All of that is very helpful in building that trust and getting us to that pull point of wanting to do it together,
Right.
versus if it were very difficult, to do all of that.
When you could think about the fact that every week these people come together on a regular basis to calm themselves, to be together, to worship, to pray together, to hope for the future. This is actually what they're doing is getting strength for the rest of the week in which we hope they will be practicing what they're learning. And we only make up less than 0.25% of the people who live in our diocese, but we impact positively today over 20% of the people who live in our diocese. And we don't think we're working on a new project to actually do better measurement, but that's the engaging the friction of a church and a neighborhood, the conversations of what the neighborhood needs. These are some things that I learned from Peter Block, right? Which is you actually have to be in the neighborhood. You have to be willing to listen to what the neighborhood needs, and you have to bring your very best selves into that conversation and not play this idea of an us and them, right? That friction actually is not a good friction. It has to be dissolved and set aside so that we can figure out, here's a problem. What's the part I bring to that? Those kind of questions that he has that are really powerful. And in some way, it's not any different than skateboarding, surfing, and sailing. As a design person, those things require friction to work. They don't work without the friction pushing against them. The wind and the wave, the spaceship and the air, the power, like all of these things are all part of the way we make our way in the world. And we can try to, I think that the human sense, and probably comes out of our basic instincts, those first instincts that come to mind, are to stop that friction from it.
Well, especially you think about some of the messages, again, we tell our young people and what they've experienced, which is like, oh, I don't want you to feel
Right.
hurt or upset or this is hard, versus like, this is hard. And that's part
Yeah.
of it. And you're
Right.
going to learn about yourself and you're going to learn
Yes.
about the process. Bob, you may not know, for the last few years, I've been working very closely with athletes
Yes.
at the
Yes. I've
collegiate
been
level,
following that. Yeah.
specifically to infuse civic engagement into their experience as athletes, because they're already doing so much of the work
Definitely.
of working across difference, coming back from setbacks, having a common purpose, and to not utilize their influence on campus to be a better image of the future, to be a better flexor, as you say, of civic faith. I think it's such a missed opportunity. So that's been my
Yes.
moonlighting project to do that. But Andy, it really speaks to this idea that the practice is a critical element. And Bob, I think you and I are big believers, like, better to rehearse the future than be blindsided by the present. Like, the
Right.
time to practice is not the crisis. That's not the
Yeah.
moment, right? It's all of that improv and experimentation that you do ahead of time, which is, of course, the work we try to do at the D School. Andy, one more thing that I heard in that is you have this beautiful chapter on a new concept to me that I think was first coined by Erik Erikson, generativity. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. As you were describing it, that's what came to mind, this kind of interconnected, fulfilling human purpose, but through others of difference and, different ages and backgrounds. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, and I want to give Bob's the one who introduced the word to us. And yet it taps deeply into what the very best of humanism, the very best of science, the very best of religious traditions hold, which is together we actually hold in our gifts, in our relationships, in our kind of discerning questions, and our capacity to work together, the very best of the whole of humanity in this sense, the very best of who we could become. It doesn't come without the darkness or the edge of that and the capacity to do real harm, right? But also in there is something amazing and beautiful that calls us forward into we might call it co-creation, mutual creation. I mean, so we would use creative words, but I really like the generativity language because it moves beyond kind of what do you think about creation? I mean, like, so we can actually lean in a word that's not owned by anybody in particular, but we also understand. And I would say, I'll turn it over to you, Bob, right after this, is that I think Jeremy would say this is the very best of what AI can do. So
Yeah.
Bob and I use, as does Jeremy, AI in a way of conversation, generating our better thoughts. And then we bring that together, and all three of us would bring that together working on this text. But that's where that generativity enabled us to really cooperate on a project. And I would suggest too that as the three of us are talking, thinking about what a living book looks like, how do we create the opportunity that this just isn't a book that you read and then you take your notes and all that, but how could we actually engage in a new way of thinking about how AI and this book could generate even more so that you didn't have to have Andy, Bob, and Jeremy in the room with you, right? Like that's a new way of thinking. And that's something that AI brings us. That's a hopeful part of bringing clarity and future thinking to us and literally every opportunity. And that we can set, how will this be better for us? Or like you can set those boundaries into AI to challenge us to see that, for instance, that we all know that there's a power issue, literally a power issue around AI development, et cetera. Well, let's solve that, right? As opposed to feeling like it's just a block that we're going to either just have to take our money and walk away, but we could actually do something different together.
To go back to this notion of framing the future, one of the challenges we had as we were writing the book is how do we frame the human side of this process? And we discovered a coincidence, which is in 1950, a psychologist named Erik Erikson coined the term generativity. And he was studying the stages of life, and he referred to the most important adult learning task, developmental task, which he called generativity, which is basically generating a future beyond yourself. That up to that stage in life, it's all about ourselves and getting ourselves safe and established and all that. And certainly for those of us who have children, that plays a role. But he said with generativity, it's what do you pass on? What's your sense beyond your isolated self? And there's a really interesting coincidence here because he published this book in 1950. 1956, at the famous Dartmouth conference, the term artificial intelligence was coined. And to me, as a futurist, artificial intelligence is the worst term to describe an emerging technology I've ever studied. I mean, he created all these stories, some of which are true, that are challenging us about how computers may replace humans. Yeah, there's real risk there, yes. But the framing was really unfortunate. Generative AI is much, much better. It's still not perfect, but it's much, much better. So we use that framing for how do we extend the human, enhance the human, stretch. My agent is nicknamed Stretch because I use it to stretch my thinking, and we talk about that in the book. But this notion of generativity, I think, is so important, and it links to faith because it's really every faith tradition I know of always involves the question of what's beyond yourself.
Hmm.
What's beyond yourself? And that's the basic of faith is what's beyond yourself. And there's different answers to that. But we found that this notion of generativity is so powerful. So we have 2 chapters in there about how you can actually use generative AI to expand yourself, to extend yourself, to bring in this notion of faith or hope in the future.
I mean, this has been part of our social conversation in the U.S. for quite some time too. Robert Bly, for instance, has this whole idea
Yes.
that if we have to get out of the adolescent society, but we can go way back to an ancient Christian source, Athanasius, who said, one of the problems is that we haven't ever grown up. And so this idea of generativity becomes this practice that I think we've tried to capture in the book and give it some sense of connection to the faith, the hope compass, the disciplines of hope, this work. And I really have, I felt like we've done a pretty good job of seeing this as a positive next step for us to try and do together versus just on my own.
No. I mean, you have a whole chapter that's really dedicated to leadership and how they can take some of these
Hmm.
concepts, and a whole separate chapter dedicated to the personal practice. As you said, Bob and Andy, a living book, right? A living
Hmm.
invitation for us. I cannot wait for it to come out. I'm flagging already that I am going to order a copy for every one of my colleagues, and I'm going to make it one of those learning books that we come back to and that we interrogate from our different lenses and have
Hmm.
discerning questions, because I think it is so powerful. And this idea of generativity, I love that you are reclaiming or I guess it is reclaiming since it was coined in the
Hmm.
50s, but
Yeah.
really bringing forward another concept that's not so laden with that
Yeah.
baggage, as you said, to invite us to think, as another earlier guest talked about, Roman Krznaric, being good
Mhm.
ancestors,
Yes.
and how we
Yes.
think about that. And certainly in my religious faith, which is about tikkun olam in the Jewish faith,
Hmm.
and one of the core concepts that we talk about just very personally in my family is the lador vador, the
Hmm.
passing on from generation to
Yes.
generation. That doesn't happen in your KPI or OKR or whatever business plan, right? It happens in the beautiful kinds of connections, Andy, that I imagine happen within your community and churches, within the conversations we build with our neighbors, and the kind of connections that we need time for, that we need to give attention to in that way.
That's a great example, though, too, of the whole piece. So, from your own tradition, right? And I only see it from outside and with friends, but whenever I'm invited, it's at around a table, and
Mhm.
and when my friends invite me over, we remind ourselves that there was no way the candles were going to stay lit. No way, but they did. There was no way we were going to be removed from our oppressors. But at this table tonight, we will remember that our oppressors did not win. And that happens at a table in which people take their spaces and their roles, and that we sing together, you eat together. We do the same thing in different ways. There are other meals across traditions. There's ways of contemplating and meditating together where then you share what you found in this time of silence. It happens around a table. And I think that this is one of the great gifts of the book. Won't be the book,
Yeah.
but exactly what you're describing in your own office with your own peers, with your own people, that if you could do this together and bring your very best selves, and then regardless of where the book is, when you bump each other into each other in the hallway, right? And you say, man, it's not working. You can remind each other, but we've been here before. We've hit a block before. We've gotten over that block. And there's a piece of the disciplines of hope compass that I think just brings back. Can we use that positive sense of the past where our ancestors were delivered? And can we show the generations in the future that they too can look back at us and remember hard times that we faced, even the end of our creation and our earth? But no, we would not be stopped. And we were good ancestors to them. And we were able to pass off not just a hopeful future, not just a bunch of stuff that we did, but a story, as to Bob's point, a story where we discerned the future and stepped into it and brought about something amazing that's worth remembering.
Maybe an opportunity to, again, share a practice that you talk about in the book that we believe strongly in How We Future, which is one of gratitude. Maybe I'll just close with some final words that you have in the book where you say, this book closes with this instruction: do not try to feel hopeful, try to practice trustworthiness. Do not try to win, try to repair. Do not seek frictionless certainty, seek practices that cost you something.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's just a true honor to continue to learn with you, from you, and to be able to share this work with a wider audience.
Thank you. It's such a delight to be here. And another thing I'll share just at the end, the book just went on pre-order on Amazon. And one of the facts of life about book publishing now is that pre-orders either help a book or kill a book. Pre-orders are so important, way more important than my earlier book. So if you're moved by this conversation, I hope you'll be moved to pre-order.
Yeah. Well, I will definitely do my part to pump
Thank you.
the pipeline of pre-orders because it's really important work.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thanks so much for listening to this conversation about hope. Remember that hope can look like asking better questions, investing in your community, or choosing curiosity over certainty. It really is the small, repeated actions that shape the future over time. If this episode sparked a new perspective, we'd love to hear from you. What's one practice that helps you stay grounded and hopeful when the future feels uncertain? Leave us a comment and join the conversation. And if you know someone who's wrestling with change or looking for a little more optimism right now, send this episode their way. Thanks for listening to How We Future. We'll see you next time.